Welcome back to episode 9 of the Gray Files, where we peel back the layers of technology, economics, data science, and the human condition itself, all in an effort to decode the vast and often perplexing world we live in. I am your host, Erika Barker, and tonight we are going to dive deep into what the deep state actually is, and more importantly, what it is not, a concept most Americans fail to understand. Whether you're the kind of person who sees conspiracies behind every headline, or the type who rolls their eyes at anything that smells like paranoia, you have been lied to in equal measure. The term deep state has become one of those phrases that instantly sorts people into tribes: believers and skeptics, patriots and paranoids, the woke and the naive. But here's the thing about tribal thinking. It usually means everyone's missing the real story. The deep state isn't what either side thinks it is. It's not a cabal of cartoon villains twirling their mustaches in smoke-filled rooms. But it's also not just a paranoid fantasy dreamed up by people who have watched way too many spy videos. The truth, as it so often does, lives in that uncomfortable space between the conspiracy theorist and the establishment apologist. It is a place where most people don't want to look because it forces you to question assumptions that make life easier to navigate. So this is the story of shadow power, how it works, why it exists, and how it has evolved from the priest of ancient Egypt to the data scientist of Silicon Valley. It is about systems that protect themselves, humans who fear chaos more than injustice, and the strange way that the people who scream loudest about shadowy control often end up building the most sophisticated control systems of all. So buckle in. We are going to explore how democracy learned to hide from itself, how software became sovereign, and why the most dangerous conspiracies aren't the ones involving secret meetings. They are the ones involving spreadsheets, algorithms, and the perfectly reasonable people who build them. Part 1. The Eternal Pattern. If you have spent any time studying human civilization, I mean really studying it, not just memorizing dates and battles, you start to notice something that should make anyone uncomfortable. There have always been two governments. There is one where everyone can see, with its ceremonies and speeches and carefully choreographed democracy, and then there is the one that actually runs things. This is not some modern American invention. It is not even a modern invention at all. If we go back to ancient Egypt, you will find the pharaoh on his throne, divine and magnificent, while the real power sits with the priestly caste who control the cosmic order, interpret the God's will, and decide what the pharaoh needs to know. The pharaoh may be the face of power, but the priests are its brain. Fast forward to Athens, the supposed birthplace of democracy, and what do you find? Socrates getting a hemlock cocktail for asking too many uncomfortable questions about how things really work. The trial wasn't about corrupting youth. It was about a man who kept pointing out that the people who are running the show might not actually know what they are doing. That has always been a dangerous occupation. Rome perfected the model. You had emperors for the spectacle and the Senate for the strategy. But if you really wanted to understand how decisions were made, you had to look at the advisors, the freedmen, the secretaries who controlled the information that reached the emperor's ears. These were not elected officials or hereditary nobles. They were the people who managed information flow. And whoever controls information flow controls everything else. The Catholic Church took this to an art form. Popes for the pageantry, but the real work happened in the background with the Jesuits. This is an organization so effective at operating in the shadows that their name became synonymous with subtle manipulation. Here is what anyone who has worked in a large organization knows. The person with the title rarely has the most power. Power flows to the people who control schedules, access, and information. It flows to the ones who decide what gets put in front of decision makers or stakeholders and what gets buried in bureaucracy. By the time America emerged as a global superpower in the 20th century, this pattern was so well established that it was almost inevitable. The CIA, the National Security Council, the think tanks, the defense contractors, they were not conspiracies. They were the natural evolution of an ancient pattern adapted for the modern world. But here is where it gets interesting, and where both the paranoids and the skeptics get it wrong. This shadow system is not some unified hive mind operated by evil geniuses. It is much more human than that, which makes it both less scary and more dangerous than either side wants to admit. Part 2: The Myth of the Mastermind. Hollywood has done democracy no favors when it comes to understanding how power actually works. Pick your favorite conspiracy thriller: The X-Files, Jason Bourne, 24, Mission Impossible, and you will see the same fantasy played out over and over. Shadowy figures with perfect information making strategic decisions to control world events. The cigarette smoking man from The X-Files became the perfect metaphor for how Americans imagine shadow power. Omniscient, omnipresent, always 3 steps ahead. He knows about the alien invasion, controls the government response, and can eliminate any threat to his carefully orchestrated plan. It is a compelling fantasy, and I use that word deliberately, because the real deep state, the actual shadow system that influences policy, looks nothing like that. Let me paint you a different picture, one based on declassified documents and the testimonies of people who actually worked inside these systems. In 2007, Tim Weiner published Legacy of Ashes, a devastating chronicle of CIA failures based on the agency's own internal documents. And what emerges is not a portrait of omniscient puppet masters, but of bureaucrats stumbling from crisis to crisis, often causing more problems than what they solve. The CIA failed to predict the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 9/11 attacks, and whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They overthrew governments based on flawed intelligence, funded dictators who later became enemies, and repeatedly told presidents what they wanted to hear rather than what was actually happening. This is not the behavior of an all-knowing cabal. It is the behavior of a large, complex organization trying to justify its existence in a world where its core assumptions keep being proven wrong. But here is the thing that should really keep you up at night. The incompetence does not matter. The system protects itself anyway. Every failure becomes justification for more resources, more power, more secrecy. Did not see 9/11 coming? Well, we need more surveillance. We screwed up Iraq's weapons of mass destruction? Well, we need better intelligence. We failed to predict the Arab Spring? Well, we need more sophisticated analysis. The deep state does not stay in power because it is good at its job. It stays in power because it's very good at redefining what its job is whenever it fails at the previous definition. And this brings us to the real engine of shadow power. It's not genius, but fear. If the deep state were truly omnipotent, you wouldn't know anything about it. But the truth leaks because us human beings leak. Consider this. Daniel Ellsberg leaked 7,000 pages of classified documents. Edward Snowden exfiltrated entire surveillance programs. Chelsea Manning downloaded war logs and diplomatic cables onto a CD labeled Lady Gaga. If secrets this significant could escape the control of America's most secure institutions, it tells you something profound. The deep state isn't some airtight vault. No, no, no. It's a clunky, paranoid bureaucracy that often gets outsmarted by idealists with a conscience and a Wi-Fi connection. The fear of a leak haunts shadow systems. It is why they invest more in surveillance than in strategy, more in damage control than in transparency. They are not afraid you will misunderstand them. They are afraid you will understand them too well. Part 3. The Paranoia Engine. Anyone who has worked in national security will tell you the same thing, usually after a few drinks and only if they trust you. The system is not driven by master plans or strategic brilliance. It is driven by terror. Terror of the masses, terror of chaos, terror of ambiguity, terror of being the one who's missed the warning sign that led to catastrophe. The fear is not irrational. History is littered with civilizations that collapse because their leaders did not see the crisis coming. But fear makes people do predictably stupid things, especially those people who have access to vast resources and limited accountability. Game theory reinforced this paranoid worldview. During the Cold War, strategic thinking became dominated by scenarios where you assumed the worst possible intentions from your opponents and planned accordingly. Always assume betrayal. Always prepare for the worst case outcome. Always have a backup plan for your backup plan. This kind of thinking creates what psychologists call confirmation bias on steroids. When you are looking for threats everywhere, you find them everywhere. When you assume bad faith from everyone, you start acting in bad faith yourself. When you plan for betrayal, you create conditions that make betrayal more likely. The result is a feedback loop that would be almost comic if it were not so consequential. Intelligence agencies identify threats that justify expanded surveillance. Expanded surveillance generates more data about potential threats. More data requires more analysts to process it. More analysts find more potential threats, and the cycle continues. But here's where the human element gets really interesting. The people inside the system are not monsters. Most of them genuinely believe they are protecting democracy. They see the threats, they know the stakes, and they are terrified of being the ones who let something slip through the cracks. Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, described this mindset perfectly. These were not evil people trying to deceive the public. They were well meaning people who had convinced themselves that lying to the public was necessary to protect the public. They had classified themselves as the guardians of truths too dangerous for ordinary citizens to handle. And that is when things get really dangerous. When the shadow systems stop seeing itself as serving democracy and starts seeing itself as protecting democracy from itself. Part 4. The Report as Gospel. If you want to understand how the modern deep state actually works, forget about the spy movies and focus on something much more mundane: the intelligence report. Not the spies, not the senators, not even the generals pulling the strings. It is the analyst, the technologist, the simulation modelers, the people who decide what information gets packaged into briefings that decision makers actually read. Because here is something that they do not teach you in civics class: presidents, prime ministers, and military commanders do not make decisions based on raw reality. They make decisions based on interpreted reality, summaries, analyses, recommendations that have been filtered through layers of institutional bias, bureaucratic priorities, and analytical frameworks. The intelligence report is not truth. It is shaped perception. And whoever controls the shaping controls everything that comes after. This is where modern technology has completely transformed the game. Today's intelligence is not just about human sources and intercepted communications. It is about predictive modeling, artificial intelligence, behavioral forecasting, sentiment analyses, essentially using software to simulate possible futures and then treating those simulations as if they were facts. Companies like Palantir have made billions building the infrastructure for this kind of analysis. They take massive data sets, everything from social media posts to financial transactions to satellite imagery, and create models that claim to predict everything from terrorist attacks to social unrest to election outcomes. Reality Winner, the NSA contractor who leaked classified documents in 2017, exposed just how tightly controlled intelligence assessments have become. Even a single document about Russian election interference, a sanitized analysis that removed specific details and methods, was treated as a state secret, because the real secret is not what the intelligence shows, it is how intelligence gets created and interpreted. And that brings us to a deeply uncomfortable truth about power in the digital age. Whoever builds the model controls the perceived future. If your algorithms predict social unrest, that prediction shapes how law enforcement responds to protest. If your simulations suggest a foreign threat, that simulation influences military planning. If your data analysis indicates economic instability, that analysis drives policy decisions. The scary part is not that these systems exist. The scary part is that the people using them forget they are using models, not reality. Part 5. Enter the techno-philosophers. Now we need to talk about Peter Thiel, because his story illustrates how ancient ideas about power have been updated for the software age. Thiel was deeply influenced by the philosophy of Leo Strauss, who taught at the University of Chicago until his death in 1973. Strauss had some very specific ideas about how society should be organized. He believed that there were fundamental truths about human nature and political organization that most people could not handle. In his view, society needed a small group of philosophical elites who understood these truths and could guide civilization without having to explain themselves to the masses. Sound familiar? Thiel absorbed these ideas and ran them through Silicon Valley's disruption machine. In his influential 2004 essay, The Straussian Moment, he applied Strauss's framework to contemporary politics and technology. Instead of philosophical elites, you have technological elites. Instead of noble lies, you have algorithmic nudging. Instead of hidden wisdom, you have proprietary data analysis. Palantir, the company Thiel co founded with Alex Karp, represents the perfect fusion of Straussian philosophy and Silicon Valley ambition. It is not officially government, but it is governmental in function. It does not make policy, but it creates the analytical frameworks that policymakers use to understand their options. Karp himself is a fascinating figure, a PhD in critical theory who spent years studying how power operates in democratic societies, now running a company that helps power operate more efficiently. He has described Palantir as building the software backbone of the West, which is either inspiring or terrifying depending on your perspective. But here is what should really get your attention. Palantir and companies like it represent a new kind of shadow power. They are not trying to overthrow democracy. They are trying to make democracy more manageable by building the technological infrastructure that helps leaders make better decisions. The question is, better for whom? Part 6. The counter-revolution becomes the revolution. Here is where the story takes a turn that would be hilarious if it were not so consequential. The people who spent years screaming about the deep state have ended up building the most sophisticated deep state apparatus in American history. MAGA paranoia about shadowy government bureaucrats led to detailed plans to dismantle the existing system and replace it with something much more centralized and ideologically controlled. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 is not just a policy wish list. It is a blueprint for shattering the traditional separation between political appointees and career civil servants, then rebuilding government around loyalist networks and tech-enabled control systems. Thiel-linked operatives have been working for years to inject artificial intelligence-driven analysis and algorithmic decision-making into government operations, all under the banner of fighting the establishment. The irony is almost too perfect. The anti-deep state movement has become a deeper deep state. But this new version is different from what came before. The old shadow system was chaotic, competing agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting priorities. The new one is being designed from the ground up with modern management techniques and digital infrastructure. Think about what that means. Instead of bureaucratic inertia and institutional rivalries creating accidental checks and balances, you get streamlined systems designed for maximum efficiency and minimum friction. Instead of career civil servants with institutional memory and professional ethics, you get political appointees selected for ideological loyalty and tech contractors with no long-term investment in democratic norms. Instead of human judgment and bureaucratic deliberation, you get algorithmic analyses and data-driven decision-making. The people building this system genuinely believe that they are saving democracy. They see themselves as the solution to government dysfunction, the cure for institutional sclerosis, the answer to bureaucratic incompetence. And you know what? They are probably right that the old system was broken. What they have not figured out is that breaking something and fixing it are two very different activities. Part 7: The New Priesthood. So, who really does run things in the 21st century? Data scientists and system architects. That's who. Not the politicians you see on TV, not the generals making speeches, not even the CEOs getting their names in the papers. The people like me who build the models, write the algorithms, and design the interfaces that everyone else uses to understand reality. This is the new priesthood. And like all priesthoods, its power comes from exclusive access to sacred knowledge. In this case, the knowledge of how to extract meaningful patterns from meaningless data. Oligarchs fund the research. Think tanks write the narratives. Technologists generate the intelligence reports. Politicians and generals read what they are given, not what is. The genius of this system is that it does not require conspiracy. It just requires specialization. When decision making becomes sufficiently complex, power naturally flows to the people who can make sense of the complexity. And in a world where making sense increasingly means building mathematical models, power flows to the people who can build the best models. But here is the thing about models: they're not neutral. Every model embeds assumptions about how the world works, what variables matter, and what outcomes are desirable. The person who designs the model gets to encode their worldview into the analytical framework that everyone else uses. Chelsea Manning revealed how this works in practice. Information flows not just passively collected and analyzed, they were actively shaped by narrative frameworks and determined what counted as relevant intelligence and what got dismissed as noise. War becomes a data analysis problem. Social unrest becomes a pattern recognition challenge. Democracy becomes an optimization exercise. And the scary part? It actually works. Sort of. These systems can predict and influence behavior with unprecedented precision. They can identify threats, allocate resources, and coordinate responses in ways that would have seemed magical to previous generations. The question is not whether they work. The question is, what exactly are they optimizing for? Part 8: When the simulation becomes the reality. We have reached a point where governance is becoming an output of private software. Electoral systems are still in place, but they are increasingly reactive rather than directive. The real decisions get made in the models and simulations that determine what options decision makers even know they have. This is not some dystopian future scenario. It is happening right now. Military planning runs through wargaming software. Economic policy gets tested in simulation models. Social programs get evaluated through algorithmic analysis. Even electoral strategies get optimized through predictive analytics and behavioral targeting. The line between the simulation and reality does not just blur, it disappears. When your models predict that a certain policy will cause social unrest and you change that policy to prevent that unrest, did the model predict the future or create it? When your algorithms identify someone as a security risk, and that identification leads to surveillance that confirms that risk, did the algorithm discover a threat or manufacture one? When your behavioral analysis suggests that voters will respond to certain messages and you use those messages to win elections, did you predict democracy or program it? This is what philosophers call the end of the exoteric world, the collapse of the distinction between hidden knowledge and public reality. Truth becomes whatever the models say it is, because the models increasingly determine what reality looks like. The priesthood is no longer composed of people who interpret ancient text. It is composed of people who write the code that interprets contemporary data. And just like the ancient priesthoods, the power depends on keeping their methods mysterious and their conclusions unchallengeable. Part 9: The Organism in the Machine. Here is what both conspiracy theorists and debunkers get wrong. The deep state is not guided by evil, and it is not guided by good intentions either. It is guided by organizational logic, the simple imperative for institutions to survive and grow. Bureaucracies evolve to defend themselves. They develop immune systems that neutralize threats to their existence. They create feedback loops that generate justifications for their expansion. They build relationships that make them indispensable to the people who could, theoretically, shut them down. This is not a conscious malice. It is institutional behavior that emerges naturally from the structure of large organizations. Anyone who has worked in government or in large institutions has seen this pattern. The mission becomes secondary to the organization's survival, and survival depends on demonstrating indispensability. In complex systems, control becomes its own ideology. The people operating the control system start to believe that control is inherently good, that more data is always better than less data, that prediction is always preferable to uncertainty. They're not wrong, exactly. Control can prevent chaos. Data can reveal important patterns. Prediction can help avoid disasters. But when control becomes the primary value, other values like freedom, privacy, autonomy, democratic deliberation get reclassified as inefficiencies to be optimized away. The American experiment was explicitly designed to prevent this kind of systemic control. Separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, individual rights. The whole constitutional framework was built around the assumption that concentrated power is dangerous, even when it's exercised by good people with good intentions. But the founders could not have anticipated software that makes coordination and control exponentially more efficient. They designed a system to prevent tyranny by making government inefficient. They did not design a system to prevent tyranny enabled by algorithms that make government hyper-efficient. Part 10: The Revolution That Ate Itself. America was born to escape monarchy and secrecy. The Declaration of Independence is literally a public rejection of hidden power, a demand that government justify itself to the people it governs. But in defending the Republic, we rebuilt a new invisible throne. The revolution that started with radical transparency ended up creating the most sophisticated surveillance and control apparatus in human history. The process was gradual and seemingly rational at each step. World War II required coordination and secrecy to defeat fascism. The Cold War required intelligence and counterintelligence to prevent nuclear annihilation. The War on Terror required surveillance and data analysis to prevent mass casualty attacks. Each crisis created institutions designed to handle that particular crisis. But institutions do not disappear when their originating crisis ends. They find new crises to justify their continued existence. The result is a system that has completely inverted the founder's intentions. Instead of government power being constrained by public accountability gets constrained by government power. Instead of officials having to justify their actions to citizens, citizens have to justify their privacy to officials. Instead of democracy controlling its security apparatus, the security apparatus increasingly controls democracy, not through coups or dramatic takeovers, but through the patient accumulation of bureaucratic power and technological capability. This is not anyone's master plan. It is the emergent result of reasonable people making reasonable decisions in response to genuine threats, which makes it much harder to fix than if it were the result of a conspiracy that could be exposed and dismantled. Part 11. Software as Sovereign. Past deep states ruled with paper trails and institutional memory. They were limited by human cognitive capacity, communication technology, and the physical constraints of information storage and processing. Today's shadow system rules through algorithms, dashboards, and behavioral forecasts that can process more information in an hour than previous generations could analyze in years. The constraints that once limited institutional power have been dissolved by digital technology. But the most important change is not the scale, it is the invisibility. Paper trails can be leaked. Human sources can develop moral dilemmas about the work they're actually doing and how it contrasts with their actual moral values. Institutional memories can be recovered through freedom of information request. Algorithmic decision-making is different. The logic is proprietary. The data inputs are classified. The analytical methods are trade secrets. Even when you can see the outputs, the reports, the recommendations, the policy proposals, you cannot reverse engineer the process that created them. This creates a new kind of unaccountable power. Decisions that can be justified as objective and data-driven while being completely opaque to outside scrutiny. The algorithm becomes sovereign in ways that human decision makers never could be, because questioning the algorithm requires technical expertise that most oversight bodies do not possess. And here is the really insidious part. The people operating these systems often do not understand them either. Machine learning models become so complex that even their creators cannot explain why they produce specific outputs. The system becomes truly autonomous, not because it is self-aware, but because it is too complex for human comprehension. We have built a technocracy that nobody controls, not even the technocrats. Part 12. The Last Noble Lie. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the shadow systems that increasingly govern our lives. What have we learned? The deep state is not a cabal of conspirators meeting in secret rooms. It is a pattern, a habit, a response to the eternal human fear of chaos. It is the predictable result of giving large organizations powerful tools and asking them to prevent bad things from happening. But the danger is not the shadow itself. The danger is when the shadow becomes the only thing left, when the systems designed to serve democracy become sophisticated enough to replace it. The final irony is almost too perfect. We built the ideal system to save ourselves from ourselves, and then forgot to include ourselves in it. The techno-utopians promise that their algorithms will make better decisions than human beings ever could. And they are probably right. Their systems can process more information, identify more patterns, and optimize more variables than any human or groups of humans ever could. The question they cannot answer is, better for what? Optimization requires objectives, and objectives require values, and values require choices about what kind of society we want to live in. Those choices used to be made through the messy, inefficient, argumentative process we call democracy. Now they are increasingly made through clean, efficient, unchallengeable process we call data analysis. The deep state, ancient or modern, analog or digital, represents the eternal temptation to trade freedom for efficiency. And the most dangerous version is the one that makes the trade without asking permission. The one that convinces us that we are getting both freedom and efficiency when we are actually getting neither. Because in the end, the shadow system serves itself. It always has, and it always will. The only question is whether we remember that we have a choice about whether to live in its shadow. The truth really is out there, but increasingly, the people with the tools to find it are the same people who get to decide what we do about it. And that might be the most important truth of all.